Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a conflict that's absolutely pivotal, but also, often misunderstood. We're talking about the Korean War. All right, so let's get right into it. In Korea, this isn't just the Korean War, it's called the 625 War. Why? Well, it's named for the day it all kicked off, June 25th. This was a brutal 3-year-long fight that started when troops poured over a line on a map, the 38th parallel. And here's the crazy part. It never officially ended with a peace treaty. It just stopped with an armistice, a ceasefire that's technically still in effect today. So to really wrap our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 4 parts. We'll look at the lead-up, the war itself, the unbelievable human cost, and finally, the legacy of division that we're still seeing today. All right, first up, a nation on edge. So how does a war like this even start? The invasion on June 25th, it really wasn't some random event. It was more like an explosion in a powder keg that had been packed and ready to blow for years. So picture this. World War II ends, Korea is finally free from Japanese rule, but then, boom, it gets split in two by the major powers. And this split, it created this incredibly tense, volatile situation. I mean, get this, there were over 100,000 casualties from border clashes before the war officially began. Let that sink in. The peninsula was basically already fighting a secret, undeclared civil war. And here's where it gets really fascinating. Neither side was okay with this division. No way. You had South Korea's president, Syngman Rhee, talking all about unification by marching north. Meanwhile, up in the north, Kim Il-sung was pushing for completing the territory. I mean, they were both basically shouting from the rooftops that they were going to unify the country by force. It wasn't a question of if, but who was going to make the first move. And it turns out, North Korea was getting ready to be that first mover. Kim Il-sung spent more than a year making sure he had the full backing of Moscow and Beijing. But then came this pivotal moment. The U.S. Secretary of State gives a speech and lays out America's defense line in Asia, the Acheson Line. And guess what? Korea was left out. To Stalin and Mao, this was like a giant green light. By May of 1950, they gave Kim the final thumbs up. The invasion was on. Okay, so that's the setup. Let's get into the war itself, because this thing was a roller coaster of invasion, intervention, and eventually stalemate. It's easy to think of a war as one long fight. But this was different. It really played out in 5 totally distinct phases. First, you have the North's big push. Then, a massive UN counterattack that flipped the whole thing on its head. Then, plot twist, China gets involved. After all that, it just grinds into this brutal, bloody stalemate, followed by 2 years of trying to talk it out. And you can really see that wild back and forth here. The initial North Korean invasion was just lightning fast. They took Seoul in 3 days. It looked like it was over. But then, just when North Korea had nearly won, General MacArthur pulls off this incredibly daring landing at Incheon, cutting the North Koreans off and totally reversing the war. So the UN forces push north, all the way to the Chinese border, and bam, China sends in hundreds of thousands of troops, pushing everyone back south. It was just insane. And after all that chaos, the front line basically settles right back where it all started, leading to that armistice in 1953. But a stalemate on a map doesn't mean the suffering stopped, not even close. To really get what this war meant, we have to talk about the staggering human cost, a peninsula just left in ruins. Okay, just look at this number. Almost 5.6 million. It's so big it's almost meaningless, right? So let's put it in perspective. The entire population of Korea at the time was around 30 million. That means roughly 1 out of every 5 people on the entire peninsula was a casualty of this war. 1 in 5. Just incredible. And when you start breaking that number down, you see where the tragedy was really centered. I mean, yes, every country involved suffered terrible losses, but it was the Korean people, North and South, who paid the ultimate price. Together, their casualties make up more than 5 million of that horrifying total. And we have to remember, these aren't just numbers on a chart. Behind every single one is a story of a family torn apart, a life lost. You can even see it in the culture of the time. This lyric from a super famous song called Be Strong, Gyumsuna, just says it all. Shedding tears of blood, I came alone. It's the voice of a refugee who lost everything, and there were millions just like her. The destruction of property was just as complete. The entire country was basically flattened. And you can see here it was especially bad in the north. Their industrial heartland was just systematically dismantled by bombing. 89% of the fuel industry, 90% of the metallurgy industry, gone, just wiped off the map. So that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the legacy of all this. A legacy of division. Because this war is really defined not by what it achieved, but by what it failed to achieve, and the deep scars it left behind. And this is maybe the greatest, most tragic irony of the whole conflict. The entire reason for the war, for both sides, was to get rid of that dividing line and make Korea one country again. And what was the result? The exact opposite. The war took that temporary line and burned it into the ground, turning it into the permanent, heavily armed border we see today. So instead of bringing the country together, the war drove it permanently apart. It locked in these opposing worldviews that define the two Koreas even now. In the South, the horror of the invasion created this really powerful anti-communist identity. And in the North, the absolute devastation of the bombing campaigns created an equally powerful anti-American one. All that hope for unity was just gone, replaced by a deep-seated hatred that still echoes through the region. Which really just leaves us with this one haunting question. The whole war started with the goal of erasing a line on a map. So how did it end up carving that line into stone? How did a war for unification become the very thing that made the division permanent? A wound that still hasn't healed all these decades later.